Go.
Good afternoon. We've been having a technical workshop here in preparation for the next Chronic Poverty Report, which is on economic growth. And two of the participants in the workshop are here with me. It's Amaresh Dubey from India and Golooba Mutebi from Uganda. And we thought we'd take the opportunity just to hear from them what are the key issues from their perspectives. So we're interested in the poorest people in the world and people who are chronically poor, so people who are poor over long periods of time. Amaresh, I just want to ask you, because South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, in particular, Afghanistan maybe, still hold a very large proportion of the world's extreme poor and also of the world's chronic poor. And I just wonder what you think the key changes and policy changes are which will help to eradicate poverty over the next 15 years in South Asia.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. The key issue is, of course, as you said, for the chronic poverty, the growth is the necessary condition. The growth must take place, and higher the growth rate, higher the growth overall, higher the possibility. I'm saying possibility because there are instances and there is evidence that higher growth is not necessarily always sort of preceded by or proceeded by pro-poorest growth, that is everybody benefiting.
Yeah.
So the key challenge would be, along with the growth, the investment in both social and economic infrastructure is something that is the way to go, because this pro-poorest growth is there because of, at least in South Asia, that includes still India and Nepal pretty much on this front, whereas Pakistan, and Pakistan actually, whereas Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have been able to come out of it there because they've made a huge lot of investment in health, education, and basic infrastructure.
Right.
In case of India, they have been making, but not to the desired level.
Okay.
In terms of health and education and basic infrastructure as well. So the basic, in fact, it's these two things are interlinked. Higher the growth, higher is the available resources for putting into these first two, that social infrastructure and economic infrastructure is something that facilitates more and more growth. So it has multiplier effect directly, whereas these two will have effect in terms of poorest participating in growth.
Okay. And we think of the poorest people in South Asia as being mostly rural and agricultural, and sometimes indigenous as well, the Adivasi population in India, for example. But I think your work is beginning to tell a different story about the distribution of poverty, that poverty is becoming much more urban. Can you tell us about that, and what are the policy responses there?
In both cases, as in case of chronically poor and the basic infrastructure required. So that infrastructure, basic infrastructure that has not been there, these smaller towns are the ones which will facilitate that. They are the ones which have the schools, which have hospitals, which have employment opportunities emerging, because everybody cannot move to the larger cities where there are more employment opportunities. So yes, the pro-poorness of growth in India especially has been in the rural areas. In fact, for the first time over the last 60, 70 years, during the last 10 years, that is starting 2004-05, it's rural areas where the growth has been more compared to the urban areas. And several of these indigenous groups, the ones which were lagging behind until about 2004-05, is the first time there is some kind of convergence that the evidence has started coming, that there is some kind of convergence. And that has been made possible because of the sustained higher growth, and then allocating resources for basic infrastructure as well as other social protection and social development programs.
And will this eventually trickle through to reducing the amount of conflict in rural India, do you think?
The conflict situation is peculiar. I mean, there are certain areas where this conflict situation has arisen in recent times, and some of the work that I have done, and in fact I shared this with Vidya a while ago. This is about the indigenous population. This is basically the indigenous population where they are not in majority. The districts where the indigenous population proportion is smaller, they have benefited not in the same proportion but along with others. And where they are in majority, for example, the entire Northeast, where the indigenous population is practically the 100% population, they have benefited significantly. But the ones where they are not in majority, the group where they are in somewhere around 40 to 50% or 40 to 60%, they are not the dominant groups in decision making. And those are the districts that have emerged as the areas where there is a kind of violence that we have observed. And what emerges from there is that there is a huge inequality that has emerged over the last 25, 30 years. So, so in terms of their gain from the growth, there are some groups that have possibly been preventing that, and that is what is reflecting in terms of their, it's a more of a, and several Indian politicians and policymakers do recognize this as one of the problems, where it is it's a more of a making these indigenous people participate in the growth is the question.
Okay. Well, this is getting to be quite a political discussion, and Fred, this is very much your field. Can you explain what politics has got to do with poverty reduction?
The connection between poverty reduction and politics is one where it's in those countries where politicians have incentives or interests in poverty reduction, the poverty reduction actually takes place. Now, in almost every country, politicians talk a lot about poverty reduction and the need to work for poor people and to reduce poverty and so on, but very few examples exist of countries where they move on to actually do something about it. It's usually making promises in order to win votes, after which they really don't follow through. Now, in countries where politicians have a keen interest in poverty reduction, failure to do so usually has political implications.
Right.
And because politicians are always minded to do things in the interest of self-preservation, where there is an imperative to reduce poverty as a political imperative, they actually go on and do it. And I think that Rwanda is a very good illustration of this, in that Rwanda has a very large number of poor and disadvantaged people. But they are part of the ethnic majority, many of whom took part in the genocide, or many of whom have been conditioned to believe that if that the Tutsi community were enemies of the state, and that if they ever came to power, they would subject them to dispossession and treat them badly and so on and so forth. So the ruling elite in Rwanda came to power in a situation where the majority neither trusted them nor wanted to work with them. So they set out to prove that all the indoctrination that had happened 30 years before they took over power was false. So it was in their interest in trying to prove this, to actually do those things that would extend prosperity to the poor majority. So that poor majority would get to understand that for you to do well, for you to prosper, the president or the leadership of the country do not have to be members of your ethnic group. Now, in a country like that, poverty reduction is a political objective. It is tied in with the government's capacity to maintain the support of the population or even to gain it. And if they fail in that, then they are working towards proving claims made previously that they were going to come and cause poverty and dispossess the population and so on.
So there's a threat factor?
There is a threat factor. And I think that even in places like Ethiopia, there is that threat factor. if you look at China also, given the size of the population, given the imperative to make sure that population is well fed and it's given the right medical care and education and so on, the price for failure is very high. So politicians are always conscious of the need to make sure they do the right thing, to make sure the population is happy. Now, in countries where you don't have those kinds of preconditions, politicians can get away with doing nothing. The consequences are not as grave as in those countries where poverty could trigger a mass rebellion on the part of the poor. So that's the connection.
Okay, and so in countries where you don't have this kind of political consensus that something must be done for the poor, with the poor, what are the options?
The options, as far as I can see, well, for people like us who do research or for people who work in policy, there is not a great deal that we can do to influence how the politics of any country works. And there can be attempts at sensitization, but also I think that there are no easy answers to the question of how you work with a political context that's not conducive to poverty reduction, to actually cause some poverty reduction. And what happens in those instances is you see that's where mechanisms like NGOs become very important, because then NGOs can do projects in rural areas that serve to promote the interests of poor people. But there isn't a great deal you can do about the politics if the politicians do not perceive an imperative to do those things.
What about the process of political change, getting political change?
I personally have a great deal of difficulty envisaging a process where you cause change from outside the political circle.
Or it could be from inside, and trying to foment it from inside, through a social movement. Or
you can, but again, we see that in Africa, even where we've had social movements that have been very promising, they excite the public for a short while, but eventually they do degenerate and become just like any other, the governments they replaced. Uganda is a very good example of this. Zimbabwe is a very good example of this. So it's those countries where you have a certain feeling of vulnerability. Either that vulnerability could actually also be externally generated, like in the case of Eritrea. In Eritrea, there's a great deal of effort put into poverty reduction, but the existential threat that the leadership of Eritrea feels is from external sources. And those external forces could have easily been able to foment rebellion inside the country if the government was not doing those things that they feel the population needs and that they will keep the population happy. So the external threat, the threat can be felt from internally, but also from externally. So once that threat is there, that always constitutes sufficient reason for politicians to pay attention to those things that are going to keep the population outside.
And if you are in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia and you are looking for inspiring models of how to move into the future, where do you look?
From within Africa itself?
No, it could be anywhere in the world. You're free to look anywhere in the world.
I mean, from Rwanda, where I spend a lot of time, the Rwandans are very keen to look at places like China.
Yeah.
China is a great inspiration for them. They are very keen to look at places like Singapore, because they think that these are places that came from nowhere. I mean, they were very poor societies, but within a generation or a generation and a half, they were able to turn their fortunes around.
Yeah.
So they're very interested in trying to understand how those processes happened. And if you look at the way Rwanda works in practice, you can see that the inspiration from China is quite high. And whereas many African governments send their civil servants for training in Western countries, increasingly Rwandan civil servants are sent to Singapore.
Right.
They're sent to South Korea. South Korea is the other inspirational country for them. There is a great deal of interaction between the government of Rwanda and the government of South Korea, to the extent that the Korean aid program in Rwanda is probably one of the biggest for South Korea.
And from South Asia?
In terms of
any models that people refer to, that people say, if only we could be more like?
Well, in terms of more like, I don't think it's referred to in India,
Okay.
except that some of the analysis that has been carried out by some of the best development economists in India and elsewhere is pointing out that what these countries, for example, China or Thailand or Korea, they did, because the comparative picture in terms of their economic status, way back in 50s, in fact, China and many of these countries were even behind India, and at the same scale, if we have to compare. But where those countries ended up today is because they, right in the beginning, they ended up spending a whole lot of resources onto the basic social infrastructure and other basic infrastructure, social infrastructure and basic infrastructure. India's sort of inward-looking policy, especially the one which has been challenged, criticized, and now pretty much known that their so-called import substitution basically backfired badly on India, and that created a sort of capacity-constrained economy. They did not have resources to invest in any of these basic infrastructure, social infrastructure, health care, education, and so on. So now, once they started opening up and competing with the rest of the world in terms of their economic structure, competitiveness, etc., the resources are becoming available, and that's how India has started investing there. So to look at other countries there is basically to look at what they did.
Yes.
In terms of the political structure, political setup, well, it's known as one of the largest democracies in the world. It has been functioning broadly, let me put it this way. Broadly, there are fissures, there are issues here and there, but it's otherwise it's not that much. And within India, if one has to look at, because the federal structure puts India in a very peculiar situation. Like Kerala is one state. With the federal structure, there are a number of these issues which are concurrent subjects. Both the state as well as the center has jurisdiction over this. For example, health, education, agriculture, land, etc., etc. So there are states that have done exceedingly well. For example, Kerala is taken as an example compared with many of the developed countries in terms of its achievement, whereas there is Bihar within not too far away, where there was this saying that it is this was in a more political connotation, it's better to be a Dalit and live in Kerala than be a forward caste and live in Bihar. That has been the sort of cliche that has been used.
Right. Okay, so lots of internal comparisons as well.
Yeah.
Thank you both very much. That gives us a very nice snapshot on some of the issues that we're tackling.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.